Orioles. Unfortunately, yesterday they lost 8-1. Can you believe that? Anyone hear of a man named the Great Bambino?
Yeah.
What was his real name? Did you meet him?
Yeah.
Congratulations. I did too. I used to rub elbows with him. My name is Damon Runyon. You may recognize that name. There's a Runyon Theater right up around the corner around here somewhere. There's also a lake just a little south of us. Can't figure why they named the lake after me. Probably figured because I drowned in it. Long ago, I was born in Manhattan. Not Manhattan, New York, but Manhattan, Kansas. Anyone ever been there? I haven't. These are the jokes, folks. How about a man named Joe Louis? Anyone hear of him?
Yeah.
How about a man named James Braddock?
Yep. Yep.
James Braddock had a different name. Anybody know what it was? I coined it. I was a sports writer. They named him the Cinderella Man. Can anyone figure why they named him the Cinderella Man? I'll tell you why. For the first several years of his boxing career, he went 50-10. That means he had 50 fights that he won. As a sports writer, I grew up right here in Pueblo. Moved here when I was 4. My mom died when I was just 5 years old and moved right back to Kansas. But I stayed here with my pop. You know what my pop did? Nope. He was a newspaper man. And guess who he worked for? The Pueblo chieftain. That's right. See, he was around. He could tell. Here, you get over here. I'm Damon Runyon, and you can tell these stories. You were there. Well, there's a lot of great stories that I would love to tell you today, and I'm just going to pick a couple of them. I want to tell you about a man named Pancho Villa. Anyone ever hear of him?
Yep.
He was a gunslinger, a bit of a rabble-rouser, a Mexican. He came over from Mexico with a whole bunch of his posse, killed 17 Americans. We killed 100 of them. And then the United States decided we were going to go pursue him into Mexico. So the New York Post decided to send me right down to Mexico to follow and write a story. We never found him. Great story that was. I'd like to tell you another story. I used to write short stories for a living. Can anyone think or know of the best story or the most popular story that I ever wrote? Guys and Dolls. See, I told you he was there.
5 for 5.
I know.
Wow.
So back in the day, if I was around, I'd call you a doll and I'd call you a guy. Maybe a broad, but just call me. And I wrote a lot of these stories, and the actual stories that I wrote were called The Idol of Sarah Brown and another one that nobody ever remembers. And I'll tell you why nobody ever remembers it. How many of you have ever read anything by Dickens? That's Charles Dickens. How about Mark Twain? Do you remember the plot of those stories? Probably not. It was me that once said, and I am Damon Runyon, but I said nobody ever remembers the plot of these stories. They remember your characters. They remember characters like Herbie the Horseface. How about that name? And Shoeless Joe Jackson. I think he played for the White Sox. Maybe. They made a lot of stories about him. And that's what they were. And I wrote short stories for a living. Did it for a long time. I started here in Pueblo at the age of 14 years old. I was already writing my first story for the Pueblo chieftain. Now, how many of you think of your 14-year-old grandson, nephew, son, daughter writing a story for the Pueblo chieftain? Now, I was also kicked out of school in the 6th grade. You probably won't want to think about your nephews and nieces getting kicked out of school in the 6th grade. But I was, and guess what I did?
Wrote stories.
Almost. I got in trouble. I was drinking and smoking and fighting and arguing by the time I was that age. My father was a newspaper man. He printed papers. So, I had a lot of free time. After work, he spent his time behind the bar, and I spent my time somewhere right around wherever Union was. From Union to Santa Fe, back alleys and that sort of thing. And that's where I learned my craft. I learned how to write about people. I learned to write about the 10-gallon hat man. He's standing right behind you in case you didn't know. All right, my phone decided it was going to go. But I learned to write stories about Ruby the Rose Tooth and that sort of thing. I gave these stories, and it was once said by some of my peers that I could sit on a bar stool for 15 hours straight without ever making it creak. Now, I've never sat on a bar stool that doesn't creak, but could you imagine sitting on one for 15 hours without making it creak? And the reason I did that is because I wanted to learn about people. And at that time, there was a lot of colorful characters right here in Pueblo. I was one of them. One of the stories they say is that I drank 40 to 60 cups of coffee a day. How many of you drink coffee? How many cups do you drink a day, sir? Maybe 5. I would put you to shame, Bart. I didn't have any teeth. And between every one of them cups of coffee, I smoked a cigarette. So if you think about that, that's 3.5 packs of cigarettes a day, along with about, I don't know, 6 to 10 pots of coffee. So that's a lot of coffee and a lot of cigarettes. So to tell you that smoking and drinking don't have really good news to come, 1938 I developed something called throat cancer. For the next 6 years of my life I was unable to speak. Died in 1946. At that time, that's when, shortly before that, my second wife left me for a younger man. Now there is a background to that. I married a woman named Ellen Egan. She told me, you better stop drinking, you better stop smoking, you better stop gambling. I couldn't do any of those but the drinking part. So while I was chasing Pancho Villa all the way through Mexico, I ended up running into a young lady. That same young lady, I paid for her education. I told her, if you ever make it to New York, I'll give you a job. So what happens? A few years later, she shows up in New York and finds me. She becomes my mistress on the side. And after I divorced my first wife, Ellen, I married her. 6 years later, she left me for a younger man. I was a drinker, I was a smoker. I gambled quite a bit. I actually owned, or was a part owner, of the boxing establishment that housed Mr. Joe Louis himself. So yes, he fought for me. So I did pretty well for myself, minus that whole throat cancer thing. But I wanted to tell you, and I want to leave you with a quote. And one of those quotes that came from a guy named Mr. Babe Ruth, who we opened up talking about tonight. And one of the most famous things that he ever told me was, he said, "It's really hard to beat a man that never quits." So you folks have a wonderful evening. My name is Damon Runyon, and enjoy the rest of the walk.
Thank you.